I was serving Sunday dinner just like I had for so many years when my daughter Linda dropped the words that broke my heart in front of the whole family. Her pension should be ours anyway. That money would be much better off with us. She said it looking right at her husband Robert as if I were just a piece of old furniture in the room. I felt my face burn with shame, but I kept serving the food pretending I hadn't heard. My grandson Michael looked down at his plate clearly uncomfortable, while my other children David and Emily just nodded silently along with their older sister. Even Louis, Emily's husband, nodded in agreement with his sister-in-law's cruel comment. This wasn't the first time I'd heard comments about my retirement, but never so direct, so cruel. After my husband John passed away 5 years ago, I moved into Linda's house because she insisted I shouldn't live alone. At first it seemed like they really cared about me. But slowly I started to realize that what they were really interested in was my financial contribution to the household expenses. My $1,800 pension wasn't a fortune, but it helped pay the bills, and they knew it very well. I always contributed everything I could, buying groceries, paying the electric bill, helping with household needs, thinking I was repaying the kindness of them taking me in. But that Sunday when I heard Linda talking about my money as if it were her right, something inside me began to wake up. I finished serving the food and retreated to my little room in the back of the house. I spent the rest of the day thinking about how I had ended up there. 50 years of marriage, 3 children raised with so much sacrifice, a whole life dedicated to my family. And now I was treated like a burden, an obstacle that was expensive to maintain. Sitting on the edge of my narrow bed looking out the small window at the yard, I wondered for the first time if it wasn't time to make a decision that no one was expecting. But what they didn't know was that everything was about to change. That night, as the house fell silent, I couldn't sleep for a moment. Linda's words repeated in my head like a painful echo. Her pension should be ours. Ours. As if my 72 years of life, the 50 years working in other people's homes since I was 15 to raise my children, meant nothing. As if my retirement was a gift that had fallen from the sky instead of the result of decades of contributions and sacrifices. I got up several times for water, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Linda's face telling Robert that my money belonged to them. During those sleepless hours, I started to remember how I'd come to live in that house. When my dear John died, I felt lost alone in our little house in the suburbs. Linda came to get me a week after the funeral crying, telling me she couldn't stand the idea of her mom living alone. "Come live with us, Mom," she said. "You don't have to worry about anything anymore. We'll take care of you." I thought it was daughterly love, that they really cared about my well-being. I sold our little house, the one John and I had bought, with so much effort and moved in with them. I put the money from the sale into a savings account just in case, but I never imagined just in case would arrive so soon. The first few months were calm. Linda seemed genuinely happy to have me there, and Robert was cordial. Michael, who was 11 at the time, was thrilled his grandmother was coming to live with them. I felt useful helping with chores, cooking their favorite meals, staying with Michael when Linda couldn't. But slowly, things started to change. First, it was small comments about household expenses. "Oh, Mom, everything is so expensive," Linda would say, checking the bills. "The lights, the water, groceries for 4 people." I immediately offered to contribute from my pension. Linda seemed surprised, as if she hadn't thought of it. "Are you sure, Mom? We don't want you to feel like you have to pay to live here." But I insisted. It was my family, my home now too, and it was only fair that I contribute what I could. So I started giving half my pension every month for expenses. Linda and Robert seemed relieved, and I felt good about being able to contribute. But as the years went by, that contribution became an expectation. Then a silent demand. And finally, according to Linda's words, that Sunday, a right they had to my money. The transformation was so gradual I barely noticed it until it was too late. At first, Linda would ask my opinion on house decisions. "What do you think, Mom? Is it okay if we change this furniture?" But over time, the questions became rare, then non-existent. I became a spectator in what was supposedly my home too. Linda and Robert made all the decisions, from what food to buy to what shows to watch on TV. When I expressed a different opinion, Linda would sigh and say, "Oh, Mom, it's not like the old days. Things have changed." And I would shut up because I didn't want to cause problems. The little room where I slept had been Robert's study before I arrived. They adapted it for me, moving the books and desk into the living room. At first, Linda said it was temporary, that they would fix up a better space for me soon. But 5 years later, I was still in that tiny room with a twin bed, a narrow wardrobe, and that little window facing the backyard. Michael had grown up and now had his own large room with a TV and video games. Linda and Robert had the master bedroom with its own bathroom. And I had my little room, which every day felt more like a favor they were doing me instead of my home. During those 5 years, I had watched my other children, David and Emily, gradually grow distant. At first, they came to visit often, but Linda always managed to make the visits uncomfortable. "Oh, Emily, you came just as we were about to leave." Or, "David, what a shame you didn't call. We don't have any food prepared." Little by little, my children got the message. Visits were not welcome at Linda's house. So now I only saw them on special occasions, and always under Linda's watchful eye. She listened to every conversation as if she owned not only the house, but my family relationships too. But what hurt the most was how Michael had started to treat me. From that loving boy who was excited to have his grandma close, he had become a teenager who saw me as part of the furniture. When I tried to talk to him, he answered in monosyllables without looking up from his phone. Linda always justified it. "It's his age, Mom. That's how kids are now." But I remembered when Michael used to ask me to tell him stories, when he asked me to teach him how to make tortillas like I did, when he asked me about his Grandpa John and listened fascinated to my stories. All of that was gone, replaced by an indifference that broke my soul. Linda and Robert's financial situation also worried me. Although they both worked, Robert at an auto parts store and Linda part-time at a government office, they always seemed to be short on money. Their salaries together should have been enough to maintain the house, but there were constant complaints about bills, unexpected expenses, things they needed but couldn't afford. I didn't understand much about numbers, but I did notice that since I started contributing my pension, Linda and Robert had started buying things they couldn't afford before: a bigger TV, a new refrigerator, brand-name clothes for Michael. It was as if my money had opened a door to a lifestyle they wanted to maintain, regardless of whether that money came from the life savings of a 72-year-old woman. And now, after that comment on Sunday, it was clear they didn't see my contribution as generous help, but as a right they had to my resources. I had gone from being the mother who sacrificed for her children to being the source of income that maintained her children's lifestyle. When I finally got up that morning at 5 a.m., something had changed inside me. I got dressed in silence and went for a walk through the still empty neighborhood streets. The cool air helped clear my thoughts. During that walk, I began to form a plan. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I knew I couldn't keep living like I had for the last 5 years. The time had come to make difficult decisions. Decisions my children might not understand, but that were necessary to get my dignity back. When I returned to the house, Linda was already awake, making breakfast. She saw me come in and frowned. "Where were you so early, Mom?" Her tone had that mix of fake concern and real annoyance I knew so well. "I went for a walk," I replied. "I needed some fresh air." Linda looked at me like I was crazy. "At your age, you shouldn't be walking alone so early. What if something happened to you?" But I no longer listened to her scolding with the submissiveness of before. For the first time in 5 years, her words just washed over me. There was something more important on my mind than her reproaches. During breakfast, I watched my family with new eyes. Robert reading the sports page without saying a word to me. Michael eating cereal while watching videos on his phone. Linda complaining about the supermarket prices and how expensive everything was. It was a scene repeated every morning. But that day I saw it with a painful clarity. I was invisible in my own family. I existed only when they needed something from me, money, help with chores, watching Michael when they went out. The rest of the time, it was as if I wasn't there. After breakfast, when Linda went to work and Robert left with Michael, I was alone in the house. It was Monday, and I had the whole week ahead to think about what I was going to do. But for the first time in a long time, that solitude didn't make me anxious. On the contrary, I felt a strange sense of freedom. No one was watching me. No one was judging me. No one was expecting anything from me. It was just me, Grace Morales, a 72-year-old woman who had finally decided she deserved better than being treated like an object in her own daughter's house. I sat on my bed and pulled out a small notebook from under the mattress where I sometimes jotted down expenses. In that notebook, I started to write. Not a letter, not a detailed plan, just loose ideas. Things I had noticed, things that had hurt me. Things I was no longer willing to tolerate. Writing helped me organize my thoughts to see clearly what until that moment had just been a confusing sense of unease. When Linda returned from work that afternoon, she found me in the living room watching TV like any other day. But something had changed in me. Something she couldn't perceive yet, but that would soon become evident. "How was your day, Mom?" she asked with that automatic politeness she used with me. "Very good, honey," I replied with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Very good." That night during dinner, Robert mentioned he'd seen a used car he liked, but they didn't have enough money for the down payment. Linda immediately started calculating out loud how they could get the money. If we used part of Mom's pension for the down payment, she said we could pay it off in small monthly installments. She spoke of my money as if it were a family bank account. As if my 72 years of work had only been to ensure them a comfortable life. But this time, instead of feeling that familiar pain in my chest, I felt something different. I felt a strange calm, as if I had finally found the answer I had been looking for years. I finished my dinner in silence, helped wash the dishes as always, and went to my room. But that night, instead of crying as I had so many times before, I sat on my bed and continued writing in my notebook. I was no longer planning just to complain or resist. I was planning my liberation. And when I finally turned off the light and closed my eyes for the first time in 5 years, I slept deeply, because I knew I had made the most important decision of my life. I was no longer going to let them treat me like a burden. The time had come to remind everyone that Grace Morales was much stronger than they had imagined. The days that followed that terrible Sunday were like waking up from a long, confusing dream. I started paying more attention to the conversations happening around the house, and what I heard opened my eyes in a way I never imagined. Linda and Robert spoke openly about plans that included my money, as if I wasn't even there anymore. I heard them discussing changing the car using part of my retirement as a down payment, and I saw when Linda showed her sister Emily a catalog of new furniture, saying they could afford that luxury now. Emily commented to her husband Louis that they could also benefit from this extra money I represented. I had become a spectator in my own life, walking through the house like a ghost that no one really saw. During those days, I also started noticing things I had ignored for the sake of peace, like the way Linda would sigh dramatically when I entered the kitchen while she was cooking, or how Robert would lower the TV volume when I sat in the living room as if my presence was an annoyance. Michael didn't even pretend to be polite anymore. When I spoke to him, he'd answer without looking up from his phone with a tone that made it clear I was interrupting him. Even meals had become tense where I ate in silence, while they made plans for the future using resources that were mine. One afternoon, while folding laundry in my room, I heard Linda talking on the phone with one of her friends. "Oh, girl, you have no idea how hard it is to live with an elderly person," she said. "It's like having a big kid who needs constant attention." My hand stopped on the blouse I was folding. "Of course she helps financially," Linda continued, "but sometimes I think it's not worth all the extra work it creates." Extra work. That's what I was to my own daughter. Extra work. Not a mother who had raised her with love, not a woman who had sacrificed her youth to give her a better life. I was extra work that was offset by money. That night when the house finally fell silent, the memories began to return with a force that took my breath away. I sat on my narrow bed and let the memories flow, because I needed to remember who I had been before I became this invisible version of myself. I remembered when Linda was 8 and got terribly sick with pneumonia. John and I didn't have health insurance, and the private hospital was our only option to save her life. I sold my only gold ring, the one my mother had given me when I got married, to pay for the treatment. Linda was in the hospital for 3 weeks, and I slept in a chair by her bed every single night, feeding her spoonful by spoonful when she could finally eat. I remembered the nights I spent awake sewing clothes to sell, working until my fingers ached to get extra money to enroll my children in better schools. John worked in construction, but his salary barely covered the basics. I took sewing jobs, washed other people's clothes, cleaned houses. Also, Linda, David, and Emily could have opportunities we never had. I remembered how I saved dollar by dollar for 2 years to throw a decent Sweet 16 party for Emily, because she had dreamed of that day since she was a little girl. I also remembered when David had problems in high school and needed private tutors so he wouldn't fail. John and I worked double shifts for months to pay for those classes. I worked cleaning offices at night after my day jobs, getting home at 2 in the morning, only to get up at 5 to make breakfast for my family. David managed to graduate and get his current job thanks to those sacrifices we made. But now when he saw me at family gatherings, it was as if all those sleepless nights, all that exhausting work, had been erased from his memory. During those sleepless nights, I began to question where I had failed as a mother. Had I been too permissive? Should I have taught my children to value the sacrifices John and I made for them more? Or maybe the problem was that I had given so much of myself that my children grew up thinking it was my obligation to sacrifice for them. I tried a few times to start conversations about my feelings, but it was like talking to walls. Linda was always busy with something important. David barely showed up at the house, and Emily only sought me out when she needed me to babysit. One Wednesday morning while cleaning the living room, I found an open envelope on the dining table. It was a bank statement for Linda and Robert. Normally, I wouldn't have looked, but the envelope was open, and the numbers were visible. I froze when I saw the amount of money they had in their savings account. Over $4,000. $4,000. While they constantly told me they had no money for anything, that everything was too expensive, that they needed my pension to survive. I felt the floor move beneath my feet. If they had that much saved, why did they need my money every month? Why did Linda constantly complain that they couldn't afford this or that? The answer was painful but clear. They didn't need my money. They wanted it. My pension wasn't helping them survive. It was extra income that allowed them to save their own money and live more comfortably. I was literally an additional source of income, an investment that gave them monthly returns in exchange for giving me food and shelter. That revelation changed something inside me. For days, I walked around the house feeling like a stranger, seeing everything with new eyes, the renovations they had done in the house the previous year. New floors, fresh paint, modern appliances, all paid for while telling me money was tight and they needed my contribution. The brand-name clothes Michael wore to school, Linda and Robert's frequent outings to restaurants. Always with the excuse that they needed a break from taking care of me. The expensive gifts they bought each other at Christmas while I was given practical things like medicine or underwear. My presence had become purely functional. I was useful for washing clothes, ironing, cooking, when Linda didn't feel like it watching the house when they went out. But my company, my feelings, my opinions, my life experiences, none of that interested them. When I tried to tell stories from my youth or talk about John, I saw their eyes glaze over, how they looked for excuses to go somewhere else. It was as if my value as a person had been reduced solely to my practical and economic utility. One night, while lying awake looking at the ceiling of my little room, I heard Linda and Robert arguing in their bedroom. The walls were thin, and even though they were speaking softly, I could hear fragments of the conversation. "It can't last forever," Robert was saying. "She's already old, and if she gets sick, maybe it would be better to start looking," Linda replied. I couldn't hear the rest, but I didn't need to. They were talking about my future, planning what to do with me when I was no longer useful, or when keeping me became more expensive than the benefits I provided. The next day was Thursday, and like every Thursday, Emily came to visit me in the afternoon. But this time, instead of being happy about her visit, I prepared myself mentally to observe her behavior with the same attention I had been paying to Linda. Emily arrived at 4 in the afternoon as usual, but I immediately noticed she was carrying a large bag. "Hi, Mom," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How have you been?" We chatted for a few minutes about trivial things, but I could feel there was something else on her mind. Finally, Emily pulled a stack of papers from the bag. "Mom, Lewis and I have been thinking about your situation here with Linda," she began, "and we think maybe it would be good for you to have some options just in case." The papers were brochures for nursing homes, places advertised as luxury residences for seniors. Emily spread them on the table as if they were vacation options. "Look, Mom, this place has beautiful gardens, activities for the residents, 24-hour medical care," Emily said with feigned enthusiasm. "And this other one has a pool and a ballroom. You could make lots of friends your own age." I picked up one of the brochures and saw the monthly price. It was the exact amount of my entire pension. It wasn't a coincidence. Emily had specifically researched places that cost all my money so that if I left, I would have nothing left to be independent. "And why do you think I need this, honey?" I asked, my voice calm, although inside I felt a mixture of pain and rage. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Well, Mom, you're not getting any younger, and Linda sometimes seems stressed. We thought that maybe in a specialized place you'd be better cared for." Specialized, as if I were mentally ill and needed special care, as if living with my own family was too heavy a burden for them. "Did Linda ask you to bring this?" I asked directly. Emily turned red and stammered a bit before answering. "Well, we've all been talking and we thought that maybe—" She couldn't finish the sentence because we both knew what was happening. My 3 children had agreed to convince me to go to a nursing home and leave them my entire pension. They had probably already calculated how to divide the money they would save by not having to support me. That night, after Emily left with her brochures under her arm and a defeated look on her face, I sat on my bed and cried for the first time in weeks. But I didn't cry out of self-pity. I cried out of anger. Anger at myself for being so blind for so long. Anger at my children for planning my future behind my back as if I were a piece of furniture that was in the way. And anger because I finally understood that all the love I had given my entire life had not been returned. I had raised 3 people who now saw me as a problem to be solved. But in the midst of that sadness, I also felt something else. Determination. For the first time in 5 years, I knew exactly what I had to do. I was no longer going to let them decide for me. I was no longer going to accept being treated like a nuisance in my own family. I was no longer going to pretend I didn't realize what was happening. The time had come to take the reins of my own life, no matter what it meant for my family relationships. On Friday morning, when Linda left for work, I took my senior ID card and left the house. I had a very specific mission: go to the bank where I received my pension and talk to an advisor about my options. During the bus ride, I mentally reviewed everything I had observed during that week: Linda and Robert's savings, Emily's plans to send me to a home, the conversations about my money as if it were theirs. It all formed a very clear pattern that I could no longer ignore. At the bank, a very kind young woman named Patricia helped me. I explained that I wanted information on how to manage my pension more independently. Patricia asked if there was a problem with how I currently received my money. And for the first time in years, I was completely honest about my situation. I told her how I had been giving half my pension for household expenses, but that I had discovered it might not be as necessary as they had led me to believe. Patricia explained all my options. I could change the direct deposit of my pension to another account at another bank. I could open a separate savings account where part of my pension would be automatically deposited each month. She also told me about government programs for seniors that I didn't know about, including discounts on medicine-free transportation and subsidized housing options for seniors with limited incomes. "Mrs. Grace," Patricia told me at the end of our conversation, "I want you to know that you have the right to manage your money as you see fit. No one, not even family, can force you to use your pension in a way that doesn't make you comfortable." Those words were like a balm for my wounded soul. For the first time in a long time, someone was reminding me that I had rights, that my money was mine, that my decisions mattered. When I returned to the house that afternoon, Linda had already come home from work and was in the kitchen making dinner. "Where were you, Mom?" she asked with that reproachful tone I knew so well. "I went to the bank," I replied simply. "The bank, what for?" Her voice became tense. "To resolve some issues with my pension," I said, and I watched her face transform. It was obvious that the idea of me going to the bank alone to resolve issues made her nervous. During dinner, Linda was quieter than usual. Robert tried to make conversation about his work, but I could feel the tension in the air. Michael, as always, ate in silence while looking at his phone. But there was something different in the family dynamic that night. Maybe it was that I no longer felt like the guest who had to be grateful for every bite of food. For the first time in 5 years, I felt like the owner of my own destiny. After dinner, while I was helping wash the dishes, Linda finally worked up the courage to ask me directly about my visit to the bank. "Mom, did something happen with your pension? Was there a problem?" I looked her in the eyes and saw something I hadn't seen in a long time: fear. Linda was afraid that I would change something in the arrangement that was so convenient for them. "No, honey," I said with a serene smile. "I just wanted to get informed about my options. A woman my age needs to be prepared for anything." That night, lying in my bed, I reflected on how different I felt after just 1 week of opening my eyes to my reality. I was no longer the submissive grandmother who accepted everything without question. I was no longer the mother who felt guilty for any inconvenience I might cause. I had become a woman with information, with options, with a plan. And although my children didn't know it yet, everything was about to change in a way they had never imagined. The transformation happening inside me wasn't just emotional. It was practical, calculated, determined. For 72 years, I had put the needs of others above my own. I had been the perfect wife, the sacrificial mother, the accommodating grandmother. But now the time had come to be something I had never been, a woman who puts herself first. And when I finally closed my eyes that night, I did so with a smile on my lips, because I knew the next chapter of my life would be completely different from the last. It was one morning the following week when I made the most important decision of my life. I woke up earlier than usual. I made the coffee as I always did, but this time I observed every movement, every word, every glance with a clarity I hadn't had in years. Linda complained that the coffee was too weak. Robert didn't even look at me. And once again I heard comments about how nice it would be to have more money available for their plans. Louis arrived early that day and joined the conversation about how to better organize the house's resources, which obviously included my retirement. At that moment, a strange calm washed over me, as if I had finally found the answer I had been searching for so long. They wanted my money, but they didn't want me. They wanted the benefits of having me there, but not my actual presence. So I decided I was going to give them exactly what they were asking for. Over the next few days, I began to take silent steps that no one noticed. The first thing I did was go back to the bank this time with a steely determination that surprised even me. Patricia, the executive who had helped me before, was happy to see me again. "What can I help you with today, Mrs. Grace?" she asked with a genuine smile. "I want to change my pension to another account," I said bluntly, "and I want it to be at a different bank where no one in my family has access." Patricia looked at me with understanding in her eyes, as if she had seen similar cases before. The process was simpler than I imagined. Patricia explained that I could transfer my pension to any bank of my choice, and the change would take effect in the next payment cycle. She also helped me open a new savings account where the money from the sale of my old house, money I had kept untouched for 5 years, would be deposited. When I saw the account statement with the total amount I had available, I was speechless. I had forgotten that I had enough money not only to be independent, but to live comfortably for many years. "Mrs. Grace," Patricia said as we reviewed the papers, "have you considered all your housing options? With the amount you have saved, plus your monthly pension, you could rent a very decent apartment, or even buy something small." Her words opened up a world of possibilities I had forgotten existed. For 5 years I had lived feeling like a burden, like someone who depended on the charity of her children. But the reality was completely different. I had enough resources to live independently with dignity without asking anyone for anything. After the bank, I walked through the downtown area with a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in decades. I stopped at a cafe and ordered a coffee and a pastry, something I hadn't done in years because Linda always said spending money on luxuries wasn't necessary. As I savored my coffee, I watched the people passing on the street. There were elderly people walking alone, women my age shopping older couples holding hands. All these people were living their lives without asking anyone for permission, without feeling like a burden. Why had I accepted living like a prisoner in my own daughter's house? That afternoon, I decided to visit my old friend Rose, who lived on the other side of town. I had kept in touch with her by phone during these 5 years, but Linda always made a face when I mentioned wanting to visit. "It's too far, Mom," Linda would say, "and transportation is so expensive." But that day I took the subway and 2 buses, and I arrived at Rose's house without asking permission from anyone. The surprise and joy on my friend's face when she saw me was something I hadn't seen in a long time in my own home. "Grace, what a wonderful surprise." Rose hugged me with a genuine affection that reminded me what it felt like to be wanted. Come in, come in. How did you get here? Did Linda bring you?" When I explained I had come alone, Rose frowned with concern. "Is everything all right, my friend? You seem different." And she was right. I was different. For the first time in 5 years, I felt like the Grace I used to be, the strong woman who had raised 3 children working day and night, the one who had faced life without fear. We spent the whole afternoon talking, and for the first time in a long time, I could speak freely about my situation without feeling like I was betraying my family. Rose listened to me attentively, without judging, without interrupting. When I finished telling her everything I had been living through, Rose was silent for a long moment. "Grace," she said finally, "what you're telling me is not right. No mother should have to live like that, feeling like a nuisance in her own children's home." "What would you do in my place?" I asked her. Rose looked me directly in the eyes. "My friend, I have a spare room here in my house. My son got married and moved out 2 years ago, and that room has been empty. Ever share the expenses and live peacefully without anyone making us feel like burdens." Her offer took me by surprise, but at the same time, I felt an emotion I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. "Are you serious, Rose?" I asked. "Completely serious," she replied. "Look, Grace, we're in our 70s. We've already raised our children. We've fulfilled our obligations as mothers and wives. Now it's time to live for ourselves. And if our children can't appreciate us as we deserve, then it's their loss, not ours." Rose's words resonated in my heart like an echo of everything I had been feeling, but hadn't dared to express. I returned to Linda's house that night with a completely new feeling. I no longer felt like a prisoner returning to her cell. I felt like a woman with options, with plans, with a future that depended only on my own decisions. When Linda saw me arrive, she immediately started with her questions and reproaches. "Where were you all day, Mom? I got home from work and you weren't here. I was so worried." But this time her words didn't affect me as before. "I went to visit Rose," I told her simply. "Rose, how did you get all the way over there? Why didn't you tell me?" The annoyance in her voice was obvious. "Linda, I am 72 years old. I am not a child. I can go where I want without asking for permission." My answer surprised her. She clearly didn't expect that attitude from me. "Well, yes, but something could have happened to you. At your age, you shouldn't be wandering around the city alone." At your age? As if being older automatically made me incapable of making my own decisions. During dinner, I noticed Linda was more observant than usual. She looked at me as if she was trying to figure out what had changed in me. Robert also seemed to sense the difference, although he couldn't pinpoint what it was. Michael, as always, was absorbed in his phone. But there was something in the family atmosphere that had changed. A new tension that didn't exist before. It was as if they could feel their control over me weakening, even if they didn't understand why. After dinner, while we were washing the dishes, Linda finally dared to ask me directly about my behavior. "Mom, is everything okay? You seem different lately." It was my chance to be honest, to explain how I felt, to try to fix our relationship. But something stopped me. Maybe it was knowing that Linda wasn't asking, because she genuinely cared about my feelings, but because she feared her extra source of income was in jeopardy. "I'm fine, honey. I said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "I've just been reflecting on my life about the future." Linda looked at me suspiciously. "What kind of reflections?" I could hear the worry in her voice, but it wasn't worry for my emotional well-being. It was worry about what my reflections might mean for her financial plans. "Just normal reflections for a woman my age," I answered vaguely. "About what I want to do with the time I have left." That night, lying in my narrow bed, I began to plan my exit in detail. I already had a place to go. Rose had offered me her home with genuine affection. I already had the financial resources, my pension transferred and my savings intact. I just needed to decide when and how to do it. I wanted it to be in a way that sent them a clear message, that I was not the helpless old woman they thought I was, but a woman capable of making important decisions about her own life. I spent the next few days carefully observing the house's routines. Linda left for work at 8 in the morning and returned at 5. Robert left at 7 and returned at 6. Michael left for school at 7:30 and returned at 2:30. This gave me a window of time in the mornings when the house was completely empty. It was the perfect time to execute my plan without unnecessary confrontations. I also began to discreetly separate my most important belongings. I didn't have many things. 5 years living in a tiny room hadn't allowed me to accumulate many possessions. But there were some family photos, important documents, a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to my mother, and some books John had given me during our marriage. Everything fit into a small suitcase I had kept under my bed since I arrived at that house. One afternoon, while Linda was at work, I called Rose to confirm our plans. "Rose," I said, "I've decided to accept your offer. When could I move in with you?" Rose was so excited she nearly shouted through the phone. "Whenever you want. Grace, the house is ready, the room is clean, and I'm thrilled to have you here." We decided I would move in the following Friday morning when everyone was out of the house. During the days leading up to my departure, I watched my family with a mixture of sadness and determination. Part of me hoped someone would notice my emotional withdrawal, that someone would ask if I was okay, that someone would show a genuine interest in my well-being. But it didn't happen. Linda kept complaining about expenses and making plans that included my money. Robert continued to ignore me completely. Michael continued to treat me as if I were invisible. And I continued to be the silent grandmother who cooked, cleaned, and paid the bills without receiving anything in return but a roof over my head. On Thursday night, my last night in that house, I couldn't sleep. Not from nerves or fear, but from a strange sense of anticipated freedom. For 5 years I had slept in that bed, feeling like a temporary guest in my daughter's house. But tonight, I knew I would never again wake up feeling like a burden to anyone. Never again would I have to ask permission to go out or justify how I spent my money or listen to conversations about my future as if I had no voice or vote in the decisions. Friday dawned cloudy, but for me, it was the brightest day I'd had in years. I waited until the whole family left as planned. Linda said goodbye with her routine kiss on my cheek. "Have a good day, Mom. See you this afternoon." But when she returned that afternoon, she wouldn't find me there. Robert left without even saying goodbye as usual. Michael yelled, "See ya, Grandma!" from the door without looking back. It was perfect, a completely normal farewell for what would be anything but a normal departure. An hour after they left, Rose arrived with a taxi as we had arranged. Seeing her standing at the door of Linda's house smiling and ready to take me to my new life filled me with an emotion I hadn't felt in decades. "Are you ready, my friend?" she asked. "More than ready," I replied, carrying my small suitcase. It was all I needed from the 5 years I lived in that house. Before I left, I placed a letter on the kitchen table. I had written it during the night, weighing every word carefully. I didn't want to be cruel, but I wanted to be clear. The letter said, "Dear family, for 5 years I have lived here feeling like a guest who must earn her keep every day. I have heard your conversations about my money as if it were yours. I have seen your plans for my future without consulting me. And I have felt how my presence has become more of a burden than a blessing, as you have made it very clear that what you value most about me is my pension. I have decided to take it with me. I will be fine, do not worry about me, and I hope that one day you understand that a mother deserves to be treated with respect and affection, not just as a source of income, with love, but also with dignity, Grace." When the taxi pulled away from the house where I had lived for the last 5 years, I didn't look back. Not out of spite, but because I was finally looking forward toward a new life where I would be respected, valued, and where my decisions mattered. Rose took my hand during the ride and said, "Grace, you are doing the right thing. Sometimes we have to walk away from the people we love to teach them how to value us." And as the taxi moved through the city streets, I smiled knowing that for the first time in 5 years, I was taking control of my own story. The letter I left on the table was short and direct, but every word had been chosen carefully. "Dear family, you have always made it very clear that my pension is more important than my presence. Now you can keep the presence, and I am keeping the pension. Do not look for me, Grace." Linda called me desperately that same day, crying and screaming on the phone, asking where I was, and demanding I return home immediately. Robert was in the background yelling about the bills due at the end of the month. But for the first time in my life, I hung up the phone on my own daughter and held firm in my decision. David showed up at Rose's house 2 days later, trying to convince me to come back. But when he saw I was well settled, that I had taken all the precautions myself, and that I showed no regret, he realized something had definitively changed in me. The first few weeks at Rose's house were a complete revelation. Waking up each morning without the feeling that I was an annoyance to someone. Eating breakfast peacefully while we chatted about our plans for the day. Being able to watch television without someone sighing because I had chosen the program. Rose became more than a friend. She became the sister I never had. Our conversations were real deep, full of mutual respect. When I talked about my past, she listened with genuine interest. When she told me about her experiences, I listened without rushing, without thinking about other things I had to do. My pension, which used to be diluted into the needs of an entire household, now allowed me to live with dignity and even some small luxuries I had never allowed myself. Rose and I split the house expenses equally, but I still had money left over to buy new clothes, to go to the beauty salon, to treat Rose to lunch at nice restaurants. For the first time in 5 years, I felt truly alive and valued. When Emily came to visit me a month later, crying and apologizing, I received her with affection, but I made it clear that my decision would not change. Rose had a group of friends who met every Wednesday at the nearby park for light exercise and conversation. At first I was shy about joining them, but Rose insisted I come along. "Grace," she said, "these ladies will understand perfectly what you've been through. Many of us have gone through similar situations." And she was right. When I met Hope, Connie, and Letty, I discovered I wasn't the only older woman who had problems with adult children who didn't value their parents. It was like belonging to a club I never knew existed. Hope told me how her son had tried to sell her house from under her to keep the money. Connie had discovered her daughter-in-law was using her debit card without permission for personal shopping. Letty had been practically a prisoner in her own home because her family had convinced her she was too old to go out alone. All of these women had had to make difficult decisions to reclaim their dignity, and they all welcomed me like a sister who had finally found the courage to stand up for herself. During those first few months, Linda tried several times to convince me to return, promising that everything would be different. But I had learned that promises made from desperation are rarely lasting. Every time we spoke, I responded with kindness, but firmness. I had already given my entire life for them. Now it was time to live for myself. When Linda made her last attempt 2 months after my departure, crying and begging at the gate of Rose's house, I looked at her through the window and whispered softly the words that sealed my fate forever. "You wanted me to disappear, so that's exactly what I did." Michael was the only one who managed to touch my heart when he came to visit me a month after everything. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Rose was at the market when the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, I found my grandson standing there, his eyes red from crying. "Grandma," he said with a broken voice I hadn't heard since he was little. "Can I come in? I need to talk to you." I invited him to sit in Rose's living room, which was now my living room too, and waited for him to find the words. "Grandma, I'm so sorry for how we treated you," Michael began, unable to look me in the eyes. "At first I didn't understand why you left. My parents said you had gone crazy, that it was a phase of old age, but later when you weren't there, I realized a lot of things." Michael told me how the house had changed after I left. Without my financial contribution, Linda and Robert had started fighting constantly about money. Without my daily care, the house was always messy and dirty. Without my home-cooked meals, they ate pizza and fast food, which cost much more than what I spent on fresh ingredients. But the worst part, Michael continued with tears in his eyes, is that I realized we never asked you how you felt. We never asked your opinion on anything. We treated you like you were invisible, except when we needed something from you. My grandson had matured a lot in those months, and for the first time in years, I could see the tender child he had been before adolescence, and his parents' example turned him into someone indifferent toward me. I explained to Michael that sometimes we have to distance ourselves from the people we love so they learn to truly value us. "I didn't leave because I don't love you," I told him. "I left because I love myself enough not to accept being treated like a nuisance." Michael asked me if I might ever come back, and I answered him honestly. "Michael, your mom and dad would have to change many things for me to consider returning, and real changes take time. They don't happen overnight." After that conversation with Michael, I started receiving occasional calls from my other children. David called me every 2 weeks to ask how I was, but I could hear the discomfort in his voice. It was clear he didn't quite know how to relate to me now that I wasn't available to him all the time. Emily came to visit me once a month, but our conversations were tense. She kept trying to convince me that I had exaggerated my reaction, that things hadn't been as bad as I perceived them. One day, Emily arrived at Rose's house with a particularly serious expression. "Mom," she said after the polite greetings, "I have something to tell you. Linda and Robert are having serious money problems. Without your pension, they can't pay all the house bills. Robert is considering getting a second job, and Linda is thinking about working full-time." The news came as no surprise. I had calculated years ago how much my contribution represented in the family budget, and I knew my departure would have significant financial consequences. "And what do you want me to do about it?" I asked Emily with genuine curiosity. "Well," she replied uncomfortably, "we thought maybe you could consider helping them a little, even if you don't live with them. Something like temporary family help." There it was again. The idea that my money should be available to my children regardless of how they treated me. "Emily," I said with a calm but firm voice, "for 5 years I helped Linda and Robert not just with money, but with housework, taking care of Michael, maintaining the house. When did they help me? When did they worry about my emotional well-being?" Emily tried to argue that family must support each other, that problems are solved together. But I was no longer interested in those speeches about family, when that same family had treated me like an object for years. "Emily, if Linda and Robert want my help, they're going to have to start by offering me sincere apologies. Not speeches about how I misinterpreted things, but real acknowledgement of how they treated me. And then they would have to prove with actions, not words, that they have truly changed." The following months were the most peaceful I had lived in years. Rose and I developed routines that made us both happy. We got up early, had breakfast while watching the news, went for walks in the park, did our shopping together, and cooked meals we actually enjoyed. In the afternoons, we sometimes read, sometimes watched soap operas, sometimes just chatted about life. It was a simple existence, but deeply satisfying. I also began to discover aspects of myself that I had forgotten during the years of living for others. I discovered that I liked to paint with watercolors, something I had done when I was young, but had abandoned when I became a mother. Rose went with me to buy art supplies, and soon we had a small makeshift studio in the room that had once been her son's. My first paintings were clumsy, but with each attempt I improved. And more importantly, I enjoyed the process of creating something beautiful just for me. One day while I was painting a landscape of the park where we walked, Rose told me something that stayed in my heart. "Grace, look at you. You're 72 years old, and you're just now starting to live your own life. Imagine everything you can do in the years you have left." And she was right. For decades, I had lived my life based on others. First my husband, then my children, then my grandchildren. But now, for the first time, I was living based on my own desires and needs. The transformation in my appearance was also noticeable. With the money I used to spend contributing to a house where I wasn't appreciated, I could now take better care of myself. I cut my hair in a more modern style, bought clothes I liked, instead of the practical clothes Linda always recommended, and even dared to wear soft makeup that made me feel younger. When Rose's friends saw me, they commented on how good I looked about the light I had in my eyes. 6 months after my departure, I received an unexpected call. It was Linda, but her tone was completely different from previous calls. There were no demands, no reproaches, no attempts at emotional manipulation. "Mom," she said with a humble voice, "could we talk? Not to ask you to come back, but to really talk. I think I need to understand a lot of things." I agreed to meet her at a neutral cafe far from both her house and Rose's house. When I arrived at the cafe, Linda was already there, and I was surprised to see how worn out she looked. She had lost weight, had dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was unkempt. She looked like a woman who had been carrying a lot of stress. We sat across from each other, and for the first time in years, Linda truly looked me in the eyes. "Mom," she began, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I think you were right about a lot of things." Linda told me what those months without me had been like. The financial problems were just the tip of the iceberg. Robert and she fought constantly, blaming each other for the situation. Michael had started to reproach them for the way they had treated me, saying he was ashamed of how they had acted. The house was always dirty, because neither of them had time to maintain it like I did. They ate poorly, spent more money on takeout, and the family atmosphere had become tense and unpleasant. But the worst part, Linda told me with tears in her eyes, is that I realized I lost my mom. Not just because you left the house, but because years ago I stopped seeing you as my mom. I saw you as someone who helped me with my problems. I never asked myself if you had your own problems, if you needed anything from me, if you felt loved or valued. It was the first time in years Linda had spoken of me as a person with my own feelings and needs, not as a function she fulfilled in her life. I asked Linda what she expected from this conversation. "I don't expect you to come back," she said. "After everything that's happened, I understand that might be impossible, but I wanted to ask for your forgiveness. Forgive me for treating you like you were invisible. Forgive me for talking about your money as if it were ours. Forgive me for not valuing everything you did for us for so many years." Her apology sounded sincere, but I had learned to be cautious. Apologies are easy to give when the consequences of mistakes become inconvenient. "Linda," I said after listening to everything she had to say, "I appreciate your apology, but apologies are only the first step. If you truly want to repair our relationship, it's going to take time. And it's going to require real changes in your behavior, not just in your words." Linda asked me what she would have to do to prove she had changed, and I gave her an answer she didn't expect. "First, learn to live without depending on me. Solve your financial problems with your own resources. Show me that you can value me for who I am, not for what I can do for you." When we left the cafe, Linda asked if she could hug me. I accepted, but it was a different hug than the ones we had shared in years. It wasn't the routine hug of a daughter going through the motions. It was the hug of a woman who finally understood she had lost something valuable and wanted to get it back. "Can I visit you from time to time?" she asked. "You can," I replied, "but as a guest, not as someone who has the right to demand my time or my presence." I returned to Rose's house that afternoon, feeling strangely at peace. I hadn't completely forgiven Linda, but I also didn't feel the bitter resentment I had carried for months. A healing process had begun that might take years to complete, but at least it had begun. Rose was waiting for me with hot tea and a curious smile. "How did it go, my friend?" she asked. "Good," I replied. "I think Linda is finally starting to understand what she lost." That night, as I prepared for bed in my room that Rose had given me with so much affection, I reflected on the journey I had taken since that terrible Sunday when Linda spoke of my pension as if it were hers. I had gone from being an invisible woman in my own daughter's house to being a respected and valued woman in the house of a true friend. I had learned that self-love is not selfishness, but survival. And I had discovered that it is never too late to change your life when you have the courage to make difficult decisions. When I finally closed my eyes that night, I did so with a smile on my lips, because I knew I had regained something I had lost for years: my dignity. And that was worth more than any pension, more than any comfort, more than any family relationship that cost me my self-respect. I had learned that sometimes the greatest love you can give to the people you care about is to teach them how to value you, even if it means walking away from them. 1 year after my decision, life had found a new rhythm, much gentler and more respectful of myself. Every morning I drank my coffee, looking out at Rose's garden, watching the birds that came to drink water from the small fountain we had installed together. There was no more rushing, no more silent demands, no more of that constant feeling of bothering someone with my presence. I discovered I had a passion for caring for plants, something I never had time to explore when I lived in the rush of serving others. My hands, once always busy with tasks for the family, now found peace planting seeds and watering flowers that grew just because I wanted to see them grow. Rose had become more than a friend. She had become the sister I never had. Our afternoon conversations, drinking tea and sharing the small joys and sorrows of the day, made me realize how much I had forgotten to cultivate true friendships. On weekends, we participated in community center activities where I met other women with stories similar to mine. Women who had also had to learn to value themselves after a lifetime of forgetting themselves. During this time, my children had gradually begun to understand the message I had sent with my departure. David visited me every month, always with a more humble attitude than before. He no longer came to ask for favors or to complain about his problems, expecting me to solve them. Now he came simply to talk, to ask how I was, to tell me about his life without expecting anything in return. It was a more mature, more balanced relationship where he saw me as a whole person and not just as his do-everything mother. Emily had started calling me every week, but her calls had also changed. They were no longer conversations where she monopolized the time talking about her problems. Now she genuinely asked about my activities, about my new friends, about my painting projects. When I told her I had sold my first watercolor at a local art fair, her excitement was authentic. "Mom, I didn't know you had so much talent," she said. "I'm so glad you're discovering new sides of yourself." Michael had become my most frequent and dearest visitor. He came to see me every 2 weeks, and our conversations had regained the warmth they had when he was a child. He told me about school, about his friends, about his plans for the future. But more importantly, he listened when I told him stories from my youth about his grandfather John, about the old days. It was as if he had rediscovered his grandmother, not as a piece of furniture in his house, but as a fascinating person with a life rich in experience. Linda took longer to adapt to the new dynamic. For months, her visits were tense, full of failed attempts to convince me to return and justifications for why things had been the way they were. But little by little, especially after our conversation in the cafe, she began to change her approach. Instead of talking about what I could do for her, she started asking what she could do for me. It was a subtle but significant change that did not go unnoticed. One Sunday afternoon, exactly 1 year after that family meal that had changed everything, Linda arrived at Rose's house with an expression I had never seen on her face. "Mom," she said after greeting me, "I wanted to ask you a very special favor." My first reaction was caution. For decades, the favors my children asked of me always involved sacrifices on my part. But Linda continued, "I wanted to ask you to teach me how to cook your favorite recipes. Not because I need you to cook for me, but because I want to learn something that you do very well." It was the first time in years that one of my children had asked me to share knowledge instead of labor or money. We spent that whole afternoon in Rose's kitchen, where I taught Linda how to make the mole sauce she loved so much as a child. While we cooked, we talked in a way we hadn't in decades. Linda told me about the problems she'd had after I left, but not to blame or manipulate me, but to explain how those problems had made her reflect on our family relationships. "Mom," she said while grinding chilies, "when you left at first I only thought about how inconvenient it was. But later when the house felt so empty, so cold, I realized it wasn't just your help I missed. It was you, your presence, your stories, your way of making everything feel like home." These were words I had waited years to hear, but they came at the perfect time, when I no longer needed them to feel complete, but could receive them as a gift. Rose watched from the living room as Linda and I cooked together, and later she told me, "Grace, your daughter is learning to see you as a person, not just as Mom. That's a very important change." And she was right. Linda no longer spoke to me with that mix of condescending affection and expectation that had characterized our relationship for years. She spoke to me as an equal, as an adult woman whose opinions and feelings mattered. When I received a call from Michael on my 73rd birthday telling me he was doing well in school and that he missed our conversations, I knew I had made the right decision. He was the only one who had managed to understand from the beginning that my distance wasn't anger, but a need for respect. "Grandma," he said on the phone, "I want you to know that you taught me something very important, that elderly people are not burdens but treasures, and that we all deserve to be treated with dignity no matter our age." One afternoon, while organizing a box of old photographs, I found a letter I had started writing to Linda weeks before making my final decision. In the letter, I was trying to explain my feelings, asking for more attention, requesting to be treated with more affection. I smiled, reading those words full of pleas and requests, because I realized how much I had changed. I no longer needed to ask to be treated with dignity. I had simply chosen to live where that happened naturally. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the box, not as a sad memory, but as a symbol of who I used to be before I learned that self-love is not selfishness. It is survival. Sometimes the biggest new beginning is the silence we choose to keep when we finally understand our own worth. Sundays had become my favorite day of the week. Rose and I had established a tradition of inviting one of our friends from the group over for lunch. We cooked together, chatted about our lives, laughed at stories from the past. It was exactly the kind of social life I had longed for years. Conversations where my presence was valued, where my opinions were heard, where my company was genuinely enjoyed. One particular Sunday, while we were preparing soup for Hope, Rose asked me a question that made me reflect deeply. "Grace, do you regret any of all that happened?" I thought carefully before answering. "I regret taking so long to value myself," I said. "I regret allowing them to treat me badly for so long, but I don't regret making the decision to change my life. That decision gave me back my dignity." We're curious to know how far this story reached. Where are you reading from? Comment below, and tell us what you think of Grace's decision. Did you ever do something similar for your own well-being? Months later, Linda surprised me with an unexpected proposal. "Mom," she said during one of her monthly visits, "Robert and I have been talking, and we want to do something for you. Not so you'll come back to live with us, but because we want to show you that we've really learned." She proposed that they pay for a trip I wanted to take, something I had always dreamed of but never allowed myself. It was the first time in decades that someone in my family offered me something without expecting anything in return. "I don't need expensive trips," I replied. "But if you really want to do something for me, come visit me more often. Not when you need something, but just because you want to spend time with me." Linda smiled with tears in her eyes. "We can do that, Mom. We can definitely do that." In the end, the most important decision of my life hadn't just been leaving Linda's house. It had been deciding that I deserved to be treated with respect and love. It had been understanding that at 72, I still had a right to happiness, to dignity, to live on my own terms. And when Rose and I sat in our living room that night, drinking tea and watching our favorite soap operas, I knew I had found something I had been searching for my whole life without knowing it. Inner peace. The story of Grace Morales didn't end when she left her daughter's house. In reality, it began that day when she decided that her value as a person did not depend on what she could give to others, but on what she was willing to accept for herself. And that lesson, more valuable than any pension, more important than any inheritance, was the gift she finally gave herself after a lifetime of giving everything to others. Because sometimes the silence we choose is more eloquent than all the words we could say, and sometimes walking away from those we love is the only way to teach them how to truly value us.